I want to begin by asking how many people here have had their horoscope read by someone at some point? A formal reading, not a printout. Okay. I want to pose a question to you, which is, what do you remember about that first experience you had sitting there with the astrologer? What went through your mind as they were telling you about yourself? The reason I ask is because I often think back to my first time. I remember it very clearly, even though it was decades ago. And it was a very strange experience. It was a paradigm shift for me because it made me realize the universe doesn't work the way I thought it did. There was something very profound about listening to this person tell me things she couldn't have known anything about with me. For example, at one point she talked about the abdominal surgery I might have had as a kid, which I had when I was about 9 months old, and things like that. And some things that struck me as very specific, and it rattled my cage, you might say, because I thought, how is this possible that she could look at where the planets are and tell me about myself? What does that imply? I thought about that, and I've thought about it a lot since then. I think your first impressions of something have a lot of insight, like beginner's mind is the way they talk about it in Zen, because there's a freshness of perception you have at that point that allows you to see things that you may not see later as you get more accustomed to that phenomena. And we're going to go a little bit later into some of these implications at the end of this talk, but the first thing I want to mention here is that what struck me the most right out of the gate was how vast this subject was. It's like you imagine opening up a closet and you find yourself walking into a 100-room mansion. Because as this astrologer was talking, I started to realize that there are many different aspects to it. I had been raised on newspaper astrology. That was the only thing I had been exposed to. The sun sign columns in newspapers. And to have this astrologer telling me all these things that went in so many different directions, it was truly mind-blowing in terms of how expansive a vision it produced. Now, what I'm going to try to do here tonight is give you a flavor of a few basic facets of astrology. We can't go over everything, obviously, but I want to give you kind of a potpourri of different facets of what astrology is about and what we try to do with it as astrologers. And the most basic way I can distill this down to kind of start with, to give us a framework, is to talk about 3 different levels of astrology that it can be applied on, 3 very basic levels: the personal level, the collective level, and the universal level. I'll go over each of these here and give you examples of each of those as we're talking here. Personal astrology, that's the one that most of us are familiar with, the astrology where we look at the horoscope of an individual. That wasn't always the case. You look back in the history of astrology and you see that there were vast periods in history where astrology was primarily practiced on a collective level for nations or for the ruler of a nation, for example. It wasn't so much a personal thing, not in all cultures anyway. And so we are familiar with this in terms of, like I said before, with sun sign astrology, but there's so much more to it than just the sun sign and the sun. This is an example of a chart. I picked this one at random. This is Taylor Swift. We're not going to interpret this. And actually, there's 2 different times that are given for Taylor Swift. I'm not as concerned about, interpreting this chart. This is just an example of all the different facets that you have here. So, for instance, you've got the sun, but you've got the Mars, the Pluto, the Uranus, Mercury, Neptune, Saturn, Venus, North Node, the Moon, Jupiter conjunction in Cancer. You've got the signs, and so on. You've got the aspects, the relationships between the planets. And this is just bare bones. There are so many more facets in astrology than what you see here. We've got the asteroids, we've got the Arabic parts, we've got the stars, the asterisms, and so on and so forth. It's endless. It could drive you crazy if you try, and it probably has driven many astrologers crazy to try to include every little thing in their readings. But this is bare bones, and this is an example of how the planets interact in a given chart. This is not typical of all charts, of course. I don't know if there is a typical chart, but an astrologer would try to read how all these different facets come together and what it means for the individual. Now, I don't want to diss sun sign astrology, because if you've ever read a book like Linda Goodman's Sun Signs, it's uncanny how accurate she is and other astrologers like her just based on the sun sign. So we are heavily influenced by the sun sign. It's just that it's not the only factor. It's one of several. And one of the criticisms you hear about sun sign astrology, and it's understandable, which is how 1/12 of the world's population falls under a given sign. So how can you generalize about that sign when it covers so many people? And the analogy I use to explain this is if you meet someone from Japan, say, and you meet someone from Italy, you automatically know something about them just because of their cultural background. Not every Italian is the same, not every Japanese person is the same. However, there are certain commonalities between the different cultures that you can generalize about within reason. In the same way, a Sagittarius like Taylor Swift, for example, has certain traits that a Scorpio may not have, although here's where we get subtle because we've got 2 planets there that are in Scorpio. So the point is that there's so many different facets to it. And one other factor here, let's move on to the next slide here. This is Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. One of the revolutions that's occurred in astrology over the last 100 years, there's been several I would call revolutions. One is the advent of computers in astrology. Another is the emergence of old astrological texts like Project Hindsight and all that, medieval astrology, Hellenistic astrology. But another revolution that's occurred in astrology that's very powerful, very important, is the advent of psychology. Up until maybe 1900, astrologers, by and large, did not really talk so much about the personality. It was mentioned, it just wasn't a primary focus. There was not a lot of talk about that inner life of what the chart showed. It was more so about circumstances, outside, external. It was more about prediction. With the advent of modern psychology, which was picked up by astrologers like Dane Rudyard and Mark Edmund Jones and Liz Green and Stephen Arroyo and countless others, we've seen a whole emphasis on this inner dimension to astrology, for better or worse. Not everybody agrees that this is a good thing. My first 2 astrologers, my first 2 astrology teachers, Goswami Kriyananda and Maureen Cleary, were diametric opposites in this regard. My first teacher was Maureen Cleary. She had a heavy background as a psychologist at the University of Chicago teaching Jungian psychology. And Kriyananda was a hardcore traditionalist. You know, he would talk about Babylonian astrology and Arabic astrology and Western astrology up till about 1900 or so. And they were both brilliant in their own ways, but total opposites in how they approached the chart. And in fact, Kriyananda looked down his nose a little bit at the modern psychological astrologers because he felt they were so vague. And other people look to the old school kind of external-oriented astrologer, the event-oriented astrologers, thinking that it's kind of superficial and only looks at the externals. There's a middle ground between these two. And what I've tried to do with my astrology is, try to strike some sort of balance between those two. And I think that's necessary because some clients, for example, might come in wanting to know strictly about the external events in their lives, and other clients might want to know strictly about psychological issues they're dealing with. So you have to be adaptable to what people want. Now, the point is that the horoscope is not a straitjacket. It's not a rigid structure that is set in concrete in a certain way. I liken it to sheet music, and what I mean by that is if you give the sheet music for, let's say, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata to Vladimir Horowitz or to Jerry Lee Lewis or to Duke Ellington, they're all going to play it differently. It's the same music, the same notes, the same signature, we presume, but they can breathe different life into the sheet music. In the same way, two different individuals can have the same horoscope, literally the same horoscope, such as twins, or people born, let's say, in the same hospital, a room apart, and yet be very different. They will have certain commonalities, but it's almost as though, well, there's so many factors that go into how you're going to express your chart. There's genetics, there's cultural background. A person that has a horoscope like this, born in Japan, is going to express this horoscope differently than someone born in America, for instance. You also have to look at historical eras. Someone that is born with this horoscope, let's say 4,000 years ago, is going to have an entirely different mindset, as well as external set of opportunities to express it. And even species type. A human is going to express this chart differently than a cow or a horse born at the same time. So you have, or a building. Electional astrology might set up a chart for a building that's constructed like 9/11, and that's a whole interesting topic in itself, like the Twin Towers. So there's a lot of factors that go into why one chart is going to manifest in multiple different ways, and I want to give you some examples of this. George Bush was born on the same day as Sylvester Stallone. All right, now they weren't born at the same time, but they were born on the same day. And externally, they seem quite different. And then one day I was looking at, this is Der Spiegel, which is a German magazine that during the Iraqi war, when they presented Bush, now I mean, look at this. I mean, you can't make this up. And so in one sense, one played Rambo in the White House, the other played Rambo on the big screen. And there's a certain synastry of energy there. And I don't mean that as a political statement either. It's just in terms of there's a commonality there. Another example is Charlie Chaplin was born 4 days apart from Adolf Hitler. And you look at the two characters, probably the two most recognizable figures in the 20th century, and they looked essentially the same, and funny enough, one actually played the other in a film. And Chaplin in an interview once said that he felt he understood Hitler. He felt he understood his psychology, which I thought was an interesting comment. But the point I'm trying to make here is that despite the similarities, despite the differences I mean between the horoscopes, there are certain fundamental commonalities archetypally, even with people that aren't born necessarily on the same day. They might be born several days apart or a week apart, as we're going to see here in a moment. Now, this is Rube Goldberg. Now, some of you might be too young to remember who that is, but Rube Goldberg was famous for devising these extraordinarily overcomplicated contraptions. And on the same day that he was born, Franz Kafka was born, who wrote The Trial and Metamorphosis and all this. And that's a scene from the Orson Welles film, The Trial with Anthony Perkins, I think it is. And both, so different on the surface, and yet both characters were involved with these overcomplicated systems. You know, it's like there's an archetypal similarity between those two figures. We go on here. Now, this is Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who was born 2 days apart from Paul McCartney. And McCartney was a huge influence on Brian Wilson, and Brian Wilson was a huge influence on Paul McCartney. Some of you know the story how Brian Wilson heard Rubber Soul, and he says, I want to make an album as great as that, so he made Pet Sounds, and McCartney heard Pet Sounds and said he wanted to top that with Sgt. Pepper and Revolver, and the funny thing is, as they've gotten older, they're getting to look more and more alike. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Now this is Kirsten Stewart, I think her name is. She's born a week apart from Emma Watson, I think it is, from and look at the similarity there. Now, it's a full week apart. You'll sometimes see commonalities even with births that are spaced apart. Now, this is a curious one. Sometimes you can see no similarity between the two people. This is Henry Kissinger, and that's James Arness, the Gunsmoke character. Some of us grew up on this. Some of you are too young to remember this, but he was in the movie The Thing and a bunch of other places. He played the monster in The Thing. Now, so it doesn't seem like there's any similarity there, but I thought this was interesting. This is a quote of Henry Kissinger's in an interview with Oriana Fallaci. Americans like the cowboy who rides all alone into the town, the village, with his horse and nothing else. This amazing romantic character suits me precisely because to be alone has always been part of my style, or if you like, my technique. It's a curious connection. Now, coming back to the sheet music analogy. So what the horoscope shows, like a piece of sheet music, is a template of possibilities, a spectrum of possibilities that can go in many different directions on many levels of subtlety, from gross to refined. Like, for example, you look at the Chaplin Hitler. One character brought laughter to the world, the other brought misery to the world. But it's a similar pattern that drove both of them if you understand the biographies and certainly if you understand the horoscopes. And this suggests that you can take your horoscope and lift it to a higher level, perhaps, if I can put it like that. An example is Jane Austen was born with an aspect that we would call Sun squaring Neptune. And in some astrological texts, they talk about that as in a woman's chart, that can be self-deception with men, that can be illusions around men and career and all that. And there's many different ways that can go. But the point is that Neptune can produce a sense of illusions. And so she took that energy, and I'm not denying she had those issues in her personal life, but she took that energy, and you have a book like Pride and Prejudice, which is all about misunderstandings and misconceptions about the other person. She took it and made something artistic out of it. And you see this time and again. Sometimes the most brilliant people, the most artistic, the most spiritual people have the most difficult horoscopes. They take that difficult energy and they do something with it. They raise it. Some people are crippled by their horoscopes. Some people they raise it up. Another example is Michael Jackson, who was born under a Mercury retrograde, which is unduly stigmatized. Fortunately, there isn't quite the negativity around Mercury retrograde now as there used to be, but he was born under Mercury retrograde. Mercury rules travel, and Mercury's going backwards, and his famous signature move is walking backwards. You see, so he took that energy that some people would consider bad. I actually know someone that didn't want to have a child under Mercury retrograde because they thought that was bad or, somehow unfortunate for the child. And yet it's all what you do with it. And I happen to believe, this is just my belief, that you have exactly the horoscope you need to accomplish what you came here to accomplish. Another example is Bob Fosse, another dancer, who had somewhat of a difficult horoscope. It's a little too subtle to go into here. But when he was younger, he had two strikes, maybe more, against him. One was he was balding prematurely. The other is he had kind of hunched over shoulders. Now, either of those is anathema for the life of a dancer. He took that, and so what did he do? He made his hat a signature. He covered his bald head with the hat, a bowler or a top hat, and then he had this hunched over kind of style to his dance. He took what other people might feel, oh, I can't become a dancer because I've got these setbacks, and he worked with it in a way that made him what he was. Okay? And this applies to something called dignities and debilitations. In astrology, we have certain ideas. These are somewhat traditional. The idea that certain placements for different planets are quote unquote better, some are worse. For example, the rulership. Take the sun, for instance. The sun is in its ruler natural position in Leo. It's in its exaltation in Aries. That means that it shines, it kind of has a better expression in that sign. It has its detriment in Aquarius, which is considered to be not so good, and it has its quote-unquote fall in Libra, which is considered in strictly black and white terms really not good. And yet, you'll see people that take these energies, and sometimes what other people might consider negative, it becomes their greatest talent. So for instance, Venus is considered to be in its fall in Virgo. All right? Look at all these performers that have Venus in Virgo. It's extraordinary. John Lennon, Mick Jagger, Sting, Joni Mitchell, John Mayer, Leonard Cohen, John Mellencamp, Eminem, PJ Harvey, Chrissy Hynde, Roger Waters, Jack White, Gwen Stefani, Keith Urban, Bryan Adams, Louis Armstrong, Lil Wayne, and Luciano Pavarotti. These poor souls. You can take, and sometimes, in fact, in the case, like I said before, sometimes the most brilliant people have the most difficult horoscopes. And that goes for these so-called difficult placements. You often see things that are traditionally considered not very good, they turn out to be their shining star in their chart. This is not to deny that they don't have problems in their personal life. I know the biographies of some of these people, and they've had plenty of problems. But the point is, there was a tendency not so long ago to look at such things as detriments or fall, or let's say you've got a Saturn square Venus or something, to take a black and white look at it. This is good, this is bad. Fortunately, that seems to be going away with modern astrologers. I don't see that nearly as much as I saw it when I first got into astrology. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a spectrum of possibilities with anything in the chart. There's nothing in the horoscope that can't be used or abused, that can't be directed constructively or destructively. So even though they may have certain problems, it's not as though, the fact that they have such great talents with this energy, it's not as though they don't also experience some of the downside of those things. But you can, like Yogananda used to say, you can overcome anything in your chart. You're not handicapped by your horoscope. It just takes more work to overcome the possibilities, those negative possibilities. So just to wrap that up, as an astrologer, I think it's the job of an astrologer to make the client aware of what that spectrum of possibilities is. So a client comes in and you see something like a Venus in Virgo, or you see something like a Neptune squaring the Sun. And you can explain to them how the negative possibilities would be this, but the positive would be that. You make them aware of that full spectrum so that they then have a choice. You don't take a simplistic sort of keyword approach and say this means that, because it's never any one thing. And a person, for instance, would express their chart differently as a 5-year-old than they will as a 70-year-old. So we grow through our chart and manifest it in different levels. Now, let's take it to the next level here. Well, to elements, before we go on to the collective. One of the key factors of astrology would be the elements, and that's earth, water, air, fire. Each one expresses a different mode of consciousness. Earth is more practical, water is more emotional, air is more intellectual, and fire is more action-oriented. It's a little bit more impulsive, more in the moment, you might say. There's triplicities. So for instance, I don't know how clear this is from where you are, but there are 3 air, 3 earth, 3 water, and 3 fire. That's another way that it's shown in some of the older texts. Now you take Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, 2 fire signs. So it goes very well together. It's a nice pairing. They're in a kind of a trine relationship, as we call it. It's fire. Now compare that to, let's say, Lennon-McCartney, 2 air signs and a trine relationship. And you look at their music, and it's quite interesting in terms of the difference, because air is more cerebral. It's a bit more, I don't want to use the word refined in a negative sense, I just mean it's definitely more cerebral, whereas fire is definitely more kind of gutsy and more forceful, more in your face. Now, I noticed something different when I was looking at charts of composers a while back. Beethoven is a fire sign and Mozart is an air sign. And you see a similar sort of dynamic between those 2 composers, because Beethoven is definitely more forceful, whereas Mozart is definitely more cerebral in that sense. Now, just before we go on, I just want to mention, you'll see certain commonalities again with the different elements. I was looking at all these performers from the last few years who are especially flamboyant, and look at how many are fire signs, which is a very expressive, extroverted energy. You've got Madonna, you've got Lady Gaga, you've got Miley Cyrus. I had to look for a picture that I could show in this audience. I had to search. It was hard finding one.
It's cropped. Yeah.
No, I didn't crop it. You've got Mae West was a Leo. You've got Jimi Hendrix, who was very flamboyant on stage as a Sagittarius. You have Jim Morrison, who was a Sagittarius. And interesting, a lot of these have Sagittarius suns, but planets in Scorpio. It's an interesting combination, you see. And Elton John is an Aries, fire sign. It's again, you see, even though it's just the sun, you still see certain energies coming through. Now, in terms of prediction, this is just one aspect of personal astrology. You can do it on a collective level too. But now I'm going to give you a simple example. There's many ways that you can do predictive patterns in a horoscope. But one of the most common is you look at where the transiting planets are moving through the horoscope. There's progressions, there's all kinds of different techniques, east and west, time lords, and so on. But you take her chart. What I've done here is I have marked a key aspect here, Pluto in Virgo 24 and the moon in 23 Sagittarius. One of the things as an astrologer you can do is look to the key stressful energy in the horoscope. Kriyananda made a comment once that if you want to understand what makes someone tick, look to their key stressful pattern. Because we're governed by our stressful patterns more than we want to realize. And that's a very tight pattern which shows emotional turmoil. You could talk about that for an hour in terms of everything that it shows, in terms of maybe some primal wounding in the life or a past life possibly. Issues of control, issues of jealousy, betrayal, theft, and so on. And as a transiting pattern, Pluto moves very slowly here. And it slowly started moving towards the moon as she got older. And in 2005, that Pluto conjuncted her moon. It crossed over that point, which any astrologer could have looked at and seen that that would be one hell of a year for her. And possibly having to do with issues of jealousy, betrayal, theft, deep insecurity, humiliation, so on and so forth. And I wouldn't say that nearly as much. If that were a trine between those two in the natal chart, I would not be nearly as concerned. But if she had come to me, she's never come to me, but if she had in 2004, I would have done my best to make her aware of what the energy showed. Not to scare her, but to at least brace her so she's not sucker punched by the transits. And so when that came across there, of course, that's when Angie Jolie came into the picture. And she felt as though her man, perhaps, I can't read her mind, but I would imagine she felt as though she had been betrayed or humiliated, maybe theft. You often see issues of theft with Pluto. It's uncanny how often that happens. And in fact, one of the major triggers of that aspect was, I think, June 7th, and the aspect completed on June 10th. So there was uncanny timing in terms of how these planets acted for her in 2005. But again, you have to be able to see all the different facets of this. You can't just look to that particular pattern and say, oh, that's a bad pattern, that's a negative pattern. It's not that simple. Because that shows a certain strength as well. That shows a certain warrior spirit in her personality. And as that came across, yes, I don't doubt that that was very traumatic for her when that hit. But I also, if you look to her in her movies and her interviews since 2005, I think she's toughened up a lot. I think it brought out her warrior spirit, her gutsiness in a certain way that would not have happened perhaps if she hadn't gone through that hell and high water. So what's the value of being able to predict with astrology? Because many people think astrology is just about prediction. It isn't. But there are values to it. Some astrologers don't do any prediction at all. They have perhaps a moral qualm about it. I don't at all. I think you have to know how to do it. But one thing is planning. Why is it valuable for a farmer to know when the seasons are? He's not going to want to plant seeds in the middle of winter. And likewise, in your own life, you want to be able to know when to time your actions. You want to know what to take advantage of. You want to know what to avoid in terms of a given year or a given period of your life. Another factor here is meaning. I had a colleague call me a few months ago who was going through a terrible, terrible situation, custody battle, under a Pluto moon, by the way. Again, issues of theft. And he didn't know anything about, well, he does know astrology, but he didn't, I think, understand perhaps all the subtleties of that energy. And just, I think, knowing that there was an astrological archetypal energy there at work with this, it gives you a certain sense of meaning. It gives you a sense that, hey, this isn't just me going crazy, or it's not just all my fault. It's like trying to have you want to have a picnic in the middle of a storm and a tornado comes up. You don't take it personally. And one of the most important things I think astrology can teach us is not to take everything so personally, that sometimes it's just the difficult energies that are in play. Like Scorpios have been through a couple very rough years. We got any Scorpios here? Okay, well, quite a few. Very rough years for about 2.5 years because Saturn's moving through Scorpio. And understanding that it's a pattern, gives you a sense of meaning that it doesn't make the problems go away, but it gives you some context, some perspective on it. And by the same token, time frame, when you know when it's going to begin and when it's going to end, there's some consolation in that as well. I had a client a few days ago that is going into a difficult period that's going to last about 2 years. And I don't sugarcoat things, but I also am careful not to put it negatively. And even though she wasn't crazy about it, she at least had some comfort in the fact that she could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that it's not going to be the rest of her life is going to be this horrible. All right. So collective astrology, what do I mean by that? Mundane astrology. You can do horoscopes for leaders. You can do horoscopes for nations. You can look at the general aspects that are affecting the whole world for masses of people. And one of the key ways you can do that, not the only way to do it, but one of the key ways of doing that is to look to the outer planets and when they come together. And by outer planets, I really mean Jupiter on out. You could be really precise and say the outer 3 planets, but you have to include Jupiter and Saturn in that. So for instance, in the mid-60s, you had Pluto and Uranus come together, which is a powerhouse combination of planets. Very revolutionary, it shakes things up in a way that is both constructive and destructive. And in 1969, Jupiter came along and conjuncted those 2 planets, creating a trifecta that was out of this world, literally, because you had Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, setting foot on the moon, almost exactly when Jupiter conjuncted the Uranus part of that alignment. Or you take, for instance, this interesting man, Walter Palmer? It sounds like a name out of Breaking Bad. And he killed that lion, Cecil the lion. And now, animals are brutalized around the world in the millions every single day. Why did this one attract so much attention? You could say, well, it's the media attention that did it, but this struck a very visceral chord for a lot of people. And if you look to the aspects at the time that happened, you'll see that Saturn was in Scorpio squaring Jupiter in Leo, the sign of the lion. Now, if you know anything about Saturn, Saturn is endings. It can be loss in the sign of Scorpio, which can be transformation and death and the esoteric things as well. And so people responded to that particular news event because it touched something very profound that was going on in the collective unconscious at that point. Or you look at what's been happening around the world the last few years with the Arab Spring, and you've had riots around the world, you've had upheavals in the Mideast of all different types. And right now we've been under the last 3 years, it's still in effect, or it's really been the last 5 to 6 years, Uranus squaring Pluto. They were together in the mid-60s and they came into a square relationship, and they've been in a square. So the seeds that were planted in the 60s are coming home to roost for better and worse. So in the last few years, you've seen some pretty profound changes in society that are very easy to take for granted, because it's like the frog in the pail. They happen slowly. But if you were to say 5 years ago, for example, that gay marriage would be legalized, that there would be several states in the U.S. with legalized pot, that the whole Middle East would be up for grabs, and so on and so forth. There have been a lot of things happening in the healthcare changes in the United States. You go back through history and you see, this is the Uranus and Pluto symbols. You see that the French Revolution occurred when Uranus was opposing Pluto. And my friend Rick Tarnas came up with a very interesting synchronicity, which is that around the same time as the revolution in France, you had the mutiny on the Bounty. Now, there was no way for those people to communicate with one another. The men on that ship were not in touch with, Twitter to what was happening in France, and yet it was the same basic archetypal energy happening. And this is the 60s riots, Detroit riots, when you had, again, that upheaval taking place when Uranus conjuncted Pluto. Certain energies produce that sort of upheaval effect. Now, an even broader magnitude of collective astrology is something we call the Great Ages. That's something that I can't go into a lot of detail here. I've done that before. There's a free lecture video here from last time I talked here, I believe. If you do a Google on my name and emerging mythologies of the Aquarian Age, you'll find the video where I go into much more depth. But basically, just to summarize, where the sun is at the first day of spring every year, it moves backwards through the zodiac every 72 years a degree. And that has a significance, according to astrologers, most astrologers, having to do with a shift in the zeitgeist, the global zeitgeist, you could say. So right now, we're somewhere in between. It's not very clear there, but we're somewhere in between those two. Now, different astrologers place a different starting date for that. I don't agree with almost any of them because I think it's a long orb. I think it's several hundred years transition. I don't think it's a date. I think there are significant dates in that process and significant years. I think we've been under one the last few years. But it's something as big as a great age that lasts over 2,000 years isn't going to just happen on a date. So it's in effect, it's been in effect at least for 200 or 300 years, at least since the discovery of Uranus in 1781, and will be going on probably for another 400 or 500 years. But let's go back a little bit. The age of Aries, that's Alexander the Great, a coin. Interestingly, he's depicted with ram's horns, which is the symbol of Aries. And you have the rise of a global religion, Judaism. There's other religions too, of course, Zoroastrianism, but both of them have fire. And what is the name of God in that religion? What was the name that God gave? I am, which is a classic Aries sort of symbol, I am. Then you come to the Piscean age, which is the age of sacrifice. That's neither good or bad. It's both. It can be sacrifice of the ego for a higher ideal, or it can be a self-destructive sort of energy. And curiously enough, the symbol for Christianity was a fish, which is a very Piscean symbol. And now we're entering the Aquarian age, which is an age of global networking. It's a highly technological age. It's an age of information, an age of data, an age of corporations and industry. It's not all good, it's not all bad. None of the ages are all good or bad. There's always a mixture, all right? Now, if you want to understand the difference between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, in my opinion, a great metaphor to focus on, to meditate on, is a Gregorian choir versus a jazz band. And let me explain this a little bit. In a Gregorian choir, you have everybody pooling their individuality towards a higher ideal. You're not really allowed to express your individuality. It's a communal sort of situation. And it's also very idealistic. It's geared towards, another world. Whereas when you talk about a jazz band, you're talking about each person is allowed to have their own individuality. There's spontaneity. There's room for spontaneity. It's not a preset sort of script, which is a whole interesting topic in itself, improvisation and jazz and Aquarius and all that. And it's more secular as well. The Aquarian age is definitely a more secular age than the Piscean age, for better and worse. But that difference that we're seeing with that jazz metaphor, that jazz archetype, we see manifesting in all kinds of ways in society already, such as democracy. Instead of a top-down rulership that you have, let's say, in the old guard, with the Aquarian age, it's more like the jazz band. Each person has a vote, ideally anyway, in the process. It's a participatory process that is the political equivalent of the jazz band. Or you take capitalism, which is the economic equivalent of the jazz band. You take communism, for example, which is a throwback to the Piscean age. That's a communal thing where you're sacrificing all of your earnings and your efforts towards a collective ideal. Or you take the political version, which is the UN, where you have a bunch of people coming together, each with their own voice. Ideally, again, we're talking ideals here, not necessarily the way it always is in reality. And in terms of religion, here's a photograph I took of this building a few years ago. You have this in religion as well, not only with the Baha'i faith, you have it with the Theosophical Society and other groups as well. This notion of there is a common sort of sheet music in terms of in Theosophy, it's the three objects. So there are certain basic points you have to follow, not have to, but you do follow if you're in the same spirit with this. And yet each person is allowed to have their own religious orientation. It's the religious equivalent of the jazz band, and that was definitely not the case in the Piscean age. It was there in pockets. You see, if you know history, you know that there were times when there was that liberal sort of tolerance, but that was not the norm. Now, I put this here not only for the humor of it, but it makes a point. Good news, I hear the paradigm is shifting. Now, the reason I bring this up is there's a certain misconception about not only these great ages and about astrology in general, but some of you might remember the 100th monkey notion. This was very big in the late 70s and into the 80s, that there's a tipping point. You know, it started with the study of these monkeys in Japan who were washing potatoes on one island, and somehow the monkeys on the next island were washing potatoes. And the theory was, which turned out not to be true, but the theory was that somehow there was, when they got to the 100th monkey, the knowledge of washing potatoes somehow transmitted over to the other island. And so some people latched onto this and took it as a very positive thing, that maybe we're all going to reach some sort of Aquarian brotherhood state where we're living in peace and the lion lays down with the lamb and all that. That isn't what astrology is about. Astrology does say that the zeitgeist changes and certain energies are more available at different times, but it doesn't mean you're just swept up in the group consciousness like a hive mind. So the example I'd use with that, going back to the mutiny on the Bounty. Why is it? You know, this was a revolutionary impulse that was sweeping through the world at that time. But why is it some of them wound up with Captain Bligh and some of them wound up with Christian? It's because, in a sense, what astrology does on a collective level is it brings out your innate tendencies. It exaggerates your already innate tendencies. It doesn't change you so much as just makes you more of what you already are. And that's why you have to be a little bit careful, because if you have some not so nice impulses, you know, you looked at what happened in Germany, for example, when we had another Uranus square Pluto energy. Similar to what we've had the last few years. The whole thing with ISIS looks to me very similar to what happened with the Nazi Party back in the 30s and early 40s. You know, was there a question? No. Let's go on here. Universal level of astrology. What do I mean by this? This is astrology studied as an archetypal language of existence, of consciousness. In other words, the belief here is that astrology somehow expresses very fundamental universal principles. And so you look at the zodiac, for instance, and this is where my one teacher, Kriyananda's teacher, Shelley Trimmer, who was a Kriya yogi down in Florida, this was his specialty, and he was quite profound at it. He talked about the planets and the signs in terms of how that relates to the inner states of consciousness. And one of the things that he taught, that he learned from Yogananda, which I've taught before here in this room, is how the zodiac and the planets relate to the inner zodiac. To, if you spin around, just to very briefly explain this, if you take the zodiac and you spin it around so that Leo and Cancer are at the very top, you see that it aligns with the classical rulerships. I'm not going to get into the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that's a whole other topic. It does fit in as harmonics, you might say. But, you know, the Mercury relates to the Vishuddha chakra, the Venus relates to the Anahata chakra, Mars relates to Manipura, Jupiter relates to Svadhisthana, Saturn relates to Muladhara chakra. And the way Shelley used to talk about it, he would say that Saturn rules Capricorn by day and Aquarius by night, Jupiter rules Sagittarius by day and Pisces by night, and so on. You know, that's the traditional way of looking at it. And so you have this level of astrology that is kind of a cipher to the cosmos in that sense. And if you want to, I went into this quite a bit more in the last lecture I gave here last year, which if you do a Google on the Divine Zodiac and my name, and you'll get the video of that if you want to see that. And something I've been tinkering with here, well, that shows like the planets in a hierarchy up to the sun. But something that I've been tinkering with lately that I'm still developing, but I've been looking at how the planets might relate to the basic mathematical principles. So for instance, Mars is the so-called lesser malefic, is division. Saturn is subtraction, when something is taken away. Jupiter is multiplication, expansion. Venus is addition. The sun, Shelley used to say that the sun is the principle of power, when it's like 4 to the 10th power, something amplified on top of itself, self-awareness, self-amplification. And the moon, I would suggest, is maybe square root. I'm not sure where Mercury fits in. But, you know, there are these possible connections that you can see with certain fundamental principles. Now, what are some of those philosophical implications of what we've been talking about here? This is a quote, a great quote by Alan Watts, What you do is what the whole universe is doing at the place you call here and now. Very profound statement. And what it implies, I think that's a great astrological type quote, because it implies what astrology really suggests as well. And that's getting back to when I went to that first astrologer and I thought, my God, I'm somehow connected to the universe. How could I be related to what Saturn and Jupiter and Mars are doing unless somehow I am connected out there? So there's a sense of a holism, an interconnectedness that you get with astrology potential. But it's not just holism, it's not just interconnection. Because you could do that in a totally pantheistic sort of cosmos. And astrology isn't just pantheistic, it implies something more. Here's a quote by the musician David Byrne, which I like. I sense the world might be more dreamlike, metaphorical, and poetic than we currently believe, but just as irrational as sympathetic magic when we look at in a typically scientific way. I wouldn't be surprised if poetry in the broadest sense, in the sense of a world filled with metaphor, rhyme, and recurring patterns, shapes, and designs, is how the world works. The world isn't logical, it's a song. The feminist poet Muriel Rukeyser put it a little bit simpler. The universe is composed of stories, not atoms. Now, what am I saying by this? In a sense, what astrology implies that there is a dimension of meaning in the world. It's not just all interconnected. There's a sense of some broader mind at work. Here's another example that might explain this. You come across a rock and there's random patterns on it. And it might be interesting, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you want to use it in a divinatory sense, but that's not what I'm talking about here. It's random patterns, it's just a rock. But let's say you come across a rock like the Rosetta Stone, like Napoleon's army found in the late 1700s, where you have language there, you have clearly some kind of meaning there. It implies that this is more than just a stone. It implies that there is some intelligence, some element of mind that's infused into this rock. And astrology suggests something like that the universe has a dimension of meaning, that Jupiter has a meaning, that Mars has a meaning, that Mercury has a meaning that isn't just in the physical body itself. As I said in the book, if you go to Jupiter and you examine, let's say with your scientific instruments, the gases and the magnetic fields of Jupiter, you're not going to find the meaning of Jupiter. It's not something you can find in the physical measurement. It's something that you have to perceive through a metaphoric mindset. This is a statement by the old Plotinus, the old Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, all teams with symbol. And this is the famous Hermetic saying, all as above, so below. And it gets into the question of archetypes, universal principles like we were hinting at before with the chakras and with mathematics, that there are somehow universal energies at work behind the everyday manifestations. Astrology is based on symbolism. It's based on a symbolic sort of mindset. And a good example of this is Mercury retrograde. We're under it right now. I think it's going direct tomorrow. Does anybody know for sure? Okay. Now, this is a good example of the symbolic side. I should know. Now, you see, the phenomena of Mercury retrograde is when it backs up and then it goes forward again. We're right at this point here right now, but here's the thing about Mercury retrograde. It's an illusion from the standpoint of the Earth. It's not actually the planet itself going backwards. So anyone that says astrology is based on energy fields from the planets, for example, how do they explain the meaning of Mercury retrograde? It has nothing to do with Mercury itself. The retrogradation process is strictly an illusion from our standpoint. So astrology is based on your perspective on Earth. It's based on symbolically looking at astronomical things. The way that Shelley put it was astrology is simply astronomy symbolically interpreted. It takes the same basic facts that the astronomer uses, but infuses those with a sense of meaning. Now that gets into a question of free will here. A story that I've told many times before, I had a client that had a very difficult planetary pattern coming up in her chart involving Neptune and Pisces. And she lived by the ocean, and I suggested to her that she had to be a little bit careful of going by the ocean or going sailing during this given period. I didn't say don't do it, I just said you have to use some caution. And so she did. She avoided the ocean, and she avoided boats, but boats didn't avoid her. And she was driving down the highway one day, and a boat came unhitched from a car in the opposite lane and flew over her car and just missed her by inches. And it happened right when her chart said she had to be careful of boats. Now, if she had left the house 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, that wouldn't have happened. What does that suggest about fate and destiny? She thought that she was acting as a free agent that day, and yet this happened. And you see this with divination. Let's say this is someone using the tarot cards, and this is someone here throwing the yarrow sticks for the I Ching. You can try as hard as you want to make it a purely random pattern as you're throwing the cards or you're throwing the sticks or the coins if you're using coins for the I Ching. It doesn't matter. It's still going to come out with some kind of meaning. Now, what does that say about your free will? No matter how hard you try, you cannot avoid putting meaning in it, which means you're connected to the cosmos even in terms of your inner decision making, which is a little bit scary in a way. Does it suggest we don't have free will? Well, maybe, maybe not, but that's a kind of puppets on a string metaphor that some people use when they talk about this dimension of astrology. We're caught in the matrix, so to speak. But there is a way out, so to speak, and that is, I'm going to use this to explain the point. The comedian Norm Macdonald did this tweet to the famous scientist and hardcore materialist Richard Dawkins, and it's a very thought-provoking question that he asked Richard Dawkins, who believes that we're kind of genetically predetermined. Professor, if a man is hardwired to survive but is aware of that hardwiring, isn't he therefore no longer hardwired? It's a great question. And you could see that Richard Dawkins, he got tongue-tied. He didn't know what to say. He says, well, that's an interesting and more difficult philosophical question. I need to think more about it. He didn't have an answer. Now, what does this have to do with astrology? What it has to do with astrology is that we may, to some extent, be programmed by the chart. But what if you can see the chart? In other words, the chart is like a script. It's like the sheet music we talked about. And once you see the script, you're no longer completely controlled by it. You can stand outside and choose not to respond to that Mars square moon or something that blows up your, temper one day. And a metaphor that I'd use for this, imagine if you found out that there was a book somewhere that had a script of your entire life from beginning to end. For every word you said, every thought, every action you did, your entire life from cradle to grave. And let's say you stumble across that book. It would be disconcerting, but at the same time liberating, because then you would know what the script is and you could choose not to respond or to respond consciously. Carl Jung had a great quote. He said, "Free will is the ability to do gladly that which I must do." And so you may choose to go with the script and play it up and have fun with it, or you may choose not to go with the script. So astrology, to some extent, allows for free will in a way that you may not have without some sort of technique like astrology. It doesn't have to be astrology. It may be dream work. It might be meditating and being able to see things from a different perspective. But I think it's a way to break free of the matrix, so to speak, break free of the strings of the puppet. Now I'm going to close with this comment, then we'll leave it open for questions here. This is a comment from my book. This is kind of the final implication of what astrology is saying, to me anyway. In order for the diverse events of our lives to be interwoven as intricately and artfully as synchronicity implies, and as systems like astrology empirically demonstrate, there would seem to be a regulating intelligence underlying our world, a central principle organizing all of its elements like notes in a grand symphony of meaning. One needn't think of this as involving a bearded anthropomorphic deity on a heavenly throne somewhere, of course. As we saw earlier, the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus referred to this transcendent principle simply as the One, while the Buddhists speak of big mind, and the mystic geometers of old described a circle whose center was everywhere but whose circumference was nowhere. Whatever labels or terms one prefers, the phenomena of synchronicity hints at a coordinating agency of unimaginable scope and subtlety whereby all the coincidences and correspondences of the world coalesce as if threads in a grand design, and within which our lives are holoscopically nested. Seen in this way, the synchronistic event can be seen as affording us a passing sideways glance, as if through a glass darkly, into the mind of God. So to me, in one sense, for astrology to work the way it does implies there's some regulating, centralizing intelligence at work. That's my take on it anyway. I want to close with that. Any questions that anybody has on anything at all?
Two screens back, did he ever answer that question after he thought about it more?
No, he did not.
He did not.
Not
Okay.
that I'm aware of, and I was watching. Maybe I missed it at some point, but he did not.
What is your opinion on the answer of that question?
I think that's exactly right. I think when you see the pattern, when you see the programming of the matrix, so to speak, or the script of the horoscope, or whatever it might be, you suddenly have distance from it. You're no longer enmeshed in it. You can stand back and choose not to do it. And I think that Norm Macdonald, who's not normally known as a philosopher, but a brilliant comic, if questionable sometimes with his routines, I think it's a great way to put it, because are we totally controlled by our genetics, by our cultural conditioning and our genetic conditioning? And if you're aware that you're controlled by those things, you're no longer controlled by them, in a sense. You have some leeway. Any other questions?
Not a question exactly, but a comment that you can think of the pattern as not being a hardwired pattern, if you like, but a pattern that has variation within that, so that there's a large structure that gives you the overall pattern, but within the pattern there are many options and variations. So it isn't exactly the same as pure determinism, even though there's a pattern.
I think that's a good way to put it. I also think it's a little bit similar to video games, in terms of you have these interactive video games where the rules are set somewhat within the game, but you have leeway within the game itself. So it doesn't have to be strict determinism, and I think astrology, to some extent, allows for that openness. Even if you're not aware of the chart, you see people that change, in a way that they may not even know their horoscope. Interesting. Thunder. I didn't even know there was going to be a storm tonight.
My question is about you personally.
Yeah.
So you went and had a reading, and then the connection was made for you, and now, I mean, you're so knowledgeable about so many facets. You've blown me away, so thank you. Was this part of, how did this work for you with your chart? Because now you've come into something that you weren't even aware of, like it just happened for you.
I was kind of open. You see, I started studying with Goswami Kriyananda in the city when I was 19. And I had my first formal chart reading when I was 20. It was somewhere in that ballpark. So I had already kind of been into the philosophical worldview to some extent. And when I had that chart reading, it was so good. It was a young woman named Debbie Scher. I don't even know if she's still alive. She was a classmate at the Art Institute. And she did an amazing job of it. And then I went to, Kriyananda, or I went to Mora, I think, before Kriyananda. And so I had maybe 5 or 6 readings. And so each time I learned a little bit more, because each reading was different. And that combined with the studies I was into with Kriyananda, which was a lot of Eastern philosophy and esoteric traditions and Hermeticism and all that, it all kind of came together, and it snowballed. And I didn't really start writing about astrology till many years later. That was like in my 30s, but I was always thinking about it. I don't know if I'm answering your question. Feel free to press me if I'm not. Well, I mean, I'm not sure what else to say about that.
I think it's fascinating that, I was just going to say, I think it's fascinating that it just, like it hit you, it struck you, but now you seem to know so much about it.
Oh, yeah, but we're talking 40 years. I mean, that first reading, which, like when I was talking here about these implications, it all kind of hit me, but I hadn't articulated it in my head. I just knew this is a way different way of looking at the world than what I learned in grade school. And I couldn't articulate what those ideas were, and it took many, many years of reading and studying it and thinking about it before I started to get clear on what this was all about. So it was a 30, 40-year process, really. And it was in tandem with my studies in synchronicity, because in college at the Art Institute, one of my film professors was a hardcore Jungian, and he introduced me to the idea of synchronicity, and that just caught my attention because I had had so many of those things in my life. So my studies of astrology kind of ran in tandem with synchronicity studies and developing that. And so the first book, The Waking Dream, was really about synchronicity and symbolism. And the second two books are more so astrology, though they all tie in with the synchronicity.
How did this astrological path show up in your natal chart?
I have a very powerful Uranus, and it's not always good. I've got 3 squares to my Uranus and a sextile to Jupiter. Tonight, I think there's a Jupiter sextile Uranus, in fact. So you're often drawn to your most stressful pattern in your chart. And if you want to be a great writer, have a T-square to your Mercury, for example. Or if you want to be a notable astrologer, pick 3 squares, 4 squares to your Uranus. So I was drawn. Kriyananda put it well. He said, you're drawn to your most stressful pattern in your horoscope. And you can either let it overpower you or you can take charge of it. And so it's also, though, I've got a very prominent Mercury and Gemini, and there's a number of things that tie into it. It's not just one planet. Does that answer your question?
What house?
Which? Uranus in the 10th. And Mercury, Sun, and Venus in the 9th house, which explains a lot of it, I think. And you often see astrologers that have Uranus in the 10th house or the 7th house or the 1st house. That's very common.
A similar question is, in the first reading, did it show that astrology would have this effect on your career? Did they show that?
She did say that with my prominent Uranus that I could get into weird things. And she included astrology. It's interesting because I've always been interested in anomalies. There's a word anomalist. I consider myself an anomalist. I like to study strange events because I think there's significant openings, anomalies either in science or in terms of things like, well, I'm not going to go there. But so she did see the possibility of astrology. She also saw the possibility of writing, which I didn't believe at all, because at the time I had no interest in writing, but she said the Mercury was so strong, and I thought it just wrote that off as a mistake. So,
What would you say about the future of astrology? Where is it going? What is its likely public image going to be in the next few years?
I think, that's an interesting question. It's a big question. I think that, first of all, so the future of astrology, it's quite exciting because there was a period when it seemed as though the younger generation wasn't picking it up. And now in the last 15 years, I've seen a lot of very brilliant younger astrologers come on who are into synthesizing East, West, traditional, modern, that sort of thing. And it's a whole new phase in astrology that was not there 20 years ago, not to this extent. It really started with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in the early 90s. And Project Hindsight and all that. So I think there's a very exciting new phase in astrology in terms of the synthesis of different ideas and some brilliant young thinkers in particular. In terms, what was the other part of that you asked about?
Well, I also asked about what do you think its public?
Oh, the public. I think it will become possible. I don't think it's ever going to become totally accepted. The scientific community will never totally embrace it because it's a hermeneutic system. It's a symbolic system. In the same way, how do you prove, for example, to go back to my example of the Mercury retrograde, like Shelley said, astrology is astronomy symbolically interpreted. How do you explain to a scientist that the astrologer sees symbolic meaning in everything that the astronomer is coming up with? It takes a whole different mindset. So I don't think scientists, and certainly not skeptics, will ever embrace it, even with statistical studies, under their arm, like the Gauguin research from years ago. But I do think on the mass level, it will get more accepted. And I think it's going to be more accepted by the intelligentsia to some extent, but never totally by the scientific community.
I am not into this as most of you people are here, but my question is simply, when I was young, there was a song, "This is the dawning of
Yeah.
the age," right? This was in the 60s. So
Yeah.
are we dawning? Are we there? What's happening?
Yeah.
I mean, we've been
Yeah.
dawning for a long time.
No, that's a good question. You see, in fact, like I said before, even though I think the age of Aquarius happens over centuries of time,
Right.
it's like the metaphor I used in Signs of the Times, which is originally going to be titled The Dawn of Aquarius, but the publisher went with that instead. When does the dawn begin? Is there a moment when you can say the dawn begins? Is it when the sun is fully over the horizon? Is it when you see the glow in the first morning? And by the same token, there is not a moment when the Aquarian age starts, but there are certain windows into the coming age, like times when it's starting to unfold more obviously. In the 60s, let me finish this. In the mid-60s, when Uranus conjuncted Pluto, it was really, in effect, the entire 60s. That song by the Fourth Dimension came out almost exactly on that Uranus-Pluto aspect. It was, I think, 67, I think, is when the Dawning of Aquarius came out. So that song, it's synchronistic, I think, that came out when it did, because I think the 60s were definitely one of those dawning points. I also think the 1790s were, I think the 1890s were, the 1920s were. The 1990s, when Uranus conjuncted Neptune in 1993, and you had the Hubble telescope became active for the first time. That's really when the internet exploded into consciousness in 94, really. But, world music was very big then. So you have these periods that are very vital in terms of that sense of the dawning that you mentioned. And that song, I think, was emblematic of that sort of, awakening period. Does that answer your question?
No.
Okay.
Are we in the dawning, or are we in the middle? Or
Oh, we're in the dawning.
We're still in the dawning.
We're in a transition period. We're in a transition period between the two ages.
Yeah.
We've got one foot in one and one foot in the other. An example of that transitional symbol would be televangelism. So, for example, televangelism is Christian Pisces in its roots, but it's the tele part of it is clearly Aquarian in terms of that whole sense of the technology. Another example of the abortion debate. That's clearly a tug of war between paradigm values, because the Piscean age is definitely that Christian sense of the and I'm not taking sides here on the issue, I'm just describing the archetypes involved. So the pro-life side is definitely Christian and Piscean in terms of that concern for the underdog, the unborn, and the Aquarian side of that divide is like individual rights, choice and that sort of thing. And you see very interesting symbols in the culture expressing this transition. Esotericists like to talk about the transition from the Taurus age into the Aries age, 4,000 years ago. One of the symbols of that was Moses casting out the golden calf, which is the Taurus symbol. The Aries age displacing the Taurus age. Now we have symbols like Moby Dick, which was in the mid-1800s, right when Uranus conjuncted Pluto, by the way, when you have this Ahab killing the whale, which is, a Piscean symbol, and Ahab representing the whaling industry, which was the first real industry in the U.S., a very Aquarian, secular sort of institution. So, we're at the dawning stage, but it's a long dawn. It started, several centuries ago, and it's going to run up for the next few centuries. Is that any better? Okay.
So my whole lifetime is going to be in the Aquarian.
No, you're in both.
Oh, okay.
You're in both. And some people are more in the other. I mean, you look at the Amish, for example, or whatever, they're clearly staying in the Piscean age. And you take even, the ISIS, you take these terrorists, they're in both worlds. They're definitely Piscean in terms of the dogmatic sort of rigidity, but they're also high tech. And so they're kind of, transitional symbols, but they're way more oriented towards that Piscean dogma.